You have human rights because you're human and not because they're written down.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the First Amendment Museum's one-on-one interview series. I'm Max Nospish, the manager of visitor experiences here at the First Amendment Museum located in Augusta, Maine. Today, I'm joined by our fabulous guest, Tarah Demant. Tarah, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to take an opportunity to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. My name is Tarah Demant. My pronouns are she, her. I am with Amnesty International USA. I am the Interim National Director of Programs, Government Relations, and Advocacy, and I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Tarah. So, Tarah, do you think the First Amendment is important, and what do you think is its purpose?
Yeah, so short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. The right to freedom of speech and expression of your belief is a central tenet in human rights. So the First Amendment is making sure that we have the right to be able to express our opposition, our satisfaction, our ideas, our discontent peacefully to the government without that freedom of fear, without freedom of retribution from the government is really central in enjoying the full spectrum of your human rights.
And what is Amnesty International and what kind of work does it do?
Yeah, the Amnesty International is a grassroots human rights organization. We are non-political, non-party affiliated, non-government affiliated organization that conducts independent research, and then we work in advocacy to try to achieve human rights. So our mission is all rights for all people. So it's a big, broad mission in all places. And we work on human rights as are outlined and defined in international human rights documents and treaties, but also human rights instruments like conventions and agreements between countries, to which places like the United States are a party to and have an obligation to uphold. But your human rights, obviously we've documented them. I can talk about all the documentation in the UDHR or in treaties, but also like you have human rights because you're human and not because they're written down. And so our job at Amnesty is to document human rights violations and then pressure governments to change that, no matter what government, no matter whose rights are being violated. That's where we are and that's what we do.
So, we obviously part of the First Amendment is freedom of assembly. And when people think of freedom of assembly, they think of protesting.
Yeah.
And one thing that I'm curious about is the right to protest under threat globally. And what are some hot spots we should all be aware of if that's happening?
Yeah, so unfortunately, yes. And actually, Amnesty International just launched a new strategic plan, and our major focus campaign is the right to protest. And that is because globally, we are seeing multiple countries and states roll back this right and attack this right. Unfortunately, it's hard to give you a hot spot because it's happening everywhere, including in the United States, where multiple individual states are seeking to pass laws that make it either harder to protest or that are meant to curtail protests. So laws that protect cars driving through protests, for example. In theory, that's not against a protest, right? But it's meant to chill protests. So we're seeing states at the individual US state level pass those laws, and we're seeing lots of versions of this at the global level. And that's because your right to protest is so important. People would not come after it if it wasn't powerful. So that freedom of assembly, where joint speech, where people are coming together to demand change, is really at risk globally. So some folks might think of like, oh yeah, sure, totalitarian governments, but this is happening all over. And because that the right is attacked so often because it's such a powerful right, mass movements and individual people too. It's not just, you don't have to be part of a giant crowd, although it can be very cathartic, but voicing your opposition, voicing your opinion in a peaceful way. And that's a human right, and it's important and attacked because it's so powerful. Mass protests can peacefully overthrow governments, right? Mass protests, peaceful protests can overthrow government. Freedom to speak out and say, like, we don't agree with this. This is wrong. This corruption is bad. This isn't happening. That's protected for a reason, but it is massively under threat. So we're launching a global campaign, which means that we'll see a lot more from Amnesty International and teaming up with people around the globe who are really at the forefront of leading in their country the right to protest, which is really under threat. And we are seeing some of, I think, the most compelling and brave and just mind-boggling activism of people who are standing against the state and exercising their right to free speech and to peaceful assembly, and in ways that are just world-changing, right? And so despite this massive crackdown, despite this massive backlash, we are also seeing a rise of activists who are standing up to these powers, who are standing up against government oppression, and who are really insisting on their right to free speech and peaceful assembly.
How has Amnesty International responded to the overturn of Roe v. Wade?
So the right to access a safe abortion is a human right guaranteed in a number of, I'm happy to send the notes later, a number of international human rights documents and guarantees, none the least of which is the right to life as someone who can give birth and die in childbirth, the right to be free from torture, being forced to carry a pregnancy, the right to the highest standard of healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So we see the issue of the right to access abortion is in the human rights framework, which is, of course, our framework, and not in the Constitution necessarily, which enshrines some human rights and maybe isn't great at others. So this has been a devastating blow, and we've already seen the sort of impact of that. We're beginning to see the impact in the United States, but at Amnesty International, we've seen the impact of these restrictions globally. We know what this means. It means a rise in maternal death and preventable maternal death. It means a rise in poverty rates. It means a widening gap between the haves and have-nots because it doesn't affect everybody equally, right? And it means a continued crackdown on speech. But the ways that we've responded to that are numerous. One, we were part of an amicus brief, so petitioning the court during this decision to consider the human rights obligations of the United States. We've also begun to roll out advocacy at the state level, because what this means now is that your right to a safe abortion, to access abortion safely and legally, is now just depends on where you live. Now, to be very clear, access to abortion has always depended on where you live. The legality, however, did not depend on where you live. And now there are 12 states as of when we're recording this, which is early September, there are 12 states that have either banned totally or near totally abortion. And we anticipate up to 26 states where the right to access and just safe access to abortion is severely under threat. So we've been doing a lot. It's been quite tiring, but also joining with, I really want to say, like, Amnesty International, a global human rights organization, and we have not been leading this work in the United States. It is on the ground people who have been fighting in the local context. Abortion is a very personal decision about your body, and so the fight for abortion has always been deeply personal and deeply local. So those folks who are funding the abortion funders, the National Network of Abortion Funds and individual state funds. There's one in Maine that funds abortions and helps people who don't just happen to have great health care that may or may not cover abortion, right? That are doing that work. And at the state level, advocates have been fighting for better reproductive rights protections, including the right to abortion. So we're joining in that advocacy as well. So the answer is a lot and not enough. And we're still engaging that. And that will be one of Amnesty USA's priorities for 2023 for a number of reasons, along with protests, right? And then, of course, like Amnesty's like real sort of niche value is that we're engaged at the UN level as well, and trying to push for stronger protections and global accountability to the treaties that the United States has signed and ratified. So we're doing all that. I would note that one of the things I think that really intersects with this question of speech and freedom of speech is the censoring of information about abortion online. And that censorship is not at this point coming from the US government, which is what freedom of speech is guaranteed, is US government speech, or freedom of speech from censorship from the US government, but by tech companies. Meta has been deleting posts, sharing information about how to access safe abortion. So about half of the abortions in the United States are done by medicine. They're not not surgical, it's just medicine. And so you can tell someone how this works. Here's how you get the pills. They are legal. It is still legal, even in states with abortion restrictions, and Meta has been taking those posts down from Facebook and Instagram. And it's the obligation of the US government to make sure that speech is protected. But ultimately, when you have a company as powerful as Facebook and Instagram, like they're kind of operating like a country, right? They are setting the reality for folks. What you see, this is the way a lot of people get information. But if they're deleting information about where you can get safe and legal abortions, like this is directing people's lives and potentially their deaths. And they're censoring it without being told by the government, right? This isn't a legal obligation in any way. This is self-censorship in terms of their censoring their own platforms. So we've been working also to make sure that people's ability to speak freely and safely on the internet in terms of safe and legal discourse, right? This is just medical information, is protected. So that intersection with speech, I think maybe won't seem as obvious to folks who maybe also care about, people's right to not be forced to carry a pregnancy, but also are like, well, that's different than free speech. Like it's not. We are having information censored all over. And that includes if you Google or use a search engine, not named Google, which might be something else, I guess, like, information in a state where abortion is illegal, are they tracking it? Are they going to turn it over to the police? These are questions about free speech and safety, fear from, freedom from fear that are really, really pertinent in the question of abortion rights.
Are global human rights advancing, retreating, both? Should we be optimistic about the future of human rights or should we be pessimistic? And maybe that's a false dichotomy, but humor me a little bit.
Well, surprising no one, it's complicated. Yes, no, and maybe. So yes, human rights are, like, the good news is that human rights are advancing. For example, over 60% of people of childbearing age in the world have access to abortion, and that is continuing to grow. That is advancing. Protections of Indigenous peoples are advancing globally. There's numerous sort of subtopics in human rights. All human rights are interdependent and interconnected, right? And we've seen many parts of human rights, I should say, advancing. And I think that's a very hopeful thing. But there is a growing anti-rights movement that is looking to restrict not just abortion, but rights around the world. And it is increasingly powerful because it is increasingly harnessed minority power. And so you have the rise of more fascist governments across the world that are not democratically responsive, that are not interested in the will or good of the people. And that is a real challenge to human rights. I should say that Amnesty does not have a specific position on types of government, but that ultimately any type of government it is has to abide by human rights. But what we're seeing is the rise of anti-democratic and anti-rights governments, where a small minority will do anything to cling to power. And the way they do that is restricting people's rights, right? So the right to participate freely in your own government is a human right laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other treaties. And for lots of countries, that looks like voting. Right. So what's the threat if people have the right to vote, if they have access to vote, if there's not a poll tax, or if they don't have to show an ID? The threat is that they vote in a way that the party in power doesn't like, right? So that's a threat. So we're seeing that crackdown, and we're seeing that here in the United States as well. So that's the disparaging news, or this dispiriting news. It's also disparaging, I suppose. But so the question, like, should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? I'll say this. Stacey Abrams, who's obviously I think people will know as a candidate, had said this one time, and I think it's really, really, really been helpful for me, which is she was talking about an election, maybe last election, and she said, I'm not optimistic and I'm not pessimistic, but I am determined. And I think that is, for me at least, as a person working in global human rights, which is working on questions of, genocide and oppression and, multiple, the worst things you could possibly document is our job, that, like, we are determined. Like, we will build this future together. And that, but also as a person sitting here in the United States in this very precarious moment, like, I am determined. And sometimes that feels hopeful and sometimes it doesn't, but it doesn't change how much work that we're going to do at Amnesty International, that I'm going to do as a human being, to make sure that purpose can be achieved. So it's a little bit of a bystep to your question, but it is, I've been thinking a lot about that, right? Because I don't know if I can always control the way I feel, but I can certainly control the way I respond to it. And that's been what I focus on a little more.
Well, Tarah, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And Is there anything you want to plug, get out there, any way people can learn more, see what you do,
Yeah.
anything, open mic hour, I guess, anything you want to get out there?
Yeah, I mean, I've got some poetry. No, I'm so grateful to talk about this in the context of free speech. I'd encourage people to learn more about human rights and the way that human rights undergirds that freedom of speech is based in human rights. It exists because we are inherently people with dignity, and it's codified in international human rights law and treaties to which the US is a party and obligated. And you can learn more at amnestyusa.org. That's the US-based section of Amnesty. If folks are interested in getting involved at the state level, protect the right to abortion, I'd recommend visiting NNAF, National Network of Abortion Funds.org, and NNAF.org to think about how you can support that work, or at amnestyusa.org/abortion. But again, amnestyusa.org is the way to connect with anybody doing this work, but also to find out more about human rights and how you can protect human rights in your own backyard.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tarah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really, really grateful to talk about it with you.